October 29th, 1929. The New York Stock Exchange collapses. In a single day, billions of dollars of paper wealth vanish. The economic panic that follows reaches into every corner of American life. Banks fail, businesses close, unemployment lines stretch around city blocks. The Great Depression has begun. For most Americans, October 1929 represents the beginning of the worst decade of their lives. For the men who ran organized crime in America, it represents something different. It represents a crisis that demands a new model, because the old model, the Capone model, the ethnic gang model, the territorial violence model, is already beginning to show its structural weaknesses even before the Depression accelerates its collapse. And the man who will build the replacement, who is sitting in his office in Manhattan, looking at what just happened to the American economy and seeing in it not catastrophe, but opportunity, is 27 years old and has been thinking about this specific problem for years. His name is Meyer Lansky, and what he builds in the decade following the crash of 1929 is not just a criminal organization. It is the first genuinely corporate criminal enterprise in American history. The prototype for every organized crime structure that has existed anywhere in the world since then. The model that the FBI, the Kefauver Committee, every subsequent investigator and prosecutor and scholar of organized crime has worked backward from to understand how the thing actually works. He builds it from scratch. From the observation of what the old model was and why it was failing. From the understanding of what a better model would look like. From 30 years old knowledge that the specific form of organizational intelligence he has been developing since he was a teenager on the Lower East Side is the kind of intelligence that can redesign a system from the ground up. And from the specific crisis of 1929 and its aftermath, which creates both the necessity and the opportunity for exactly the redesign he has in mind. To understand what Meyer Lansky builds, you have to understand what existed before he builds it. What existed before was a collection of ethnic gangs operating in specific territories with specific methods and specific limitations that made them locally powerful and nationally irrelevant. The Italian families in New York and Chicago, the Jewish gangs in the same cities, the Irish organizations, the nascent African-American numbers operations in Harlem, the various regional operations in cities across the country, all of them territorial, all of them defined by ethnicity and geography, all of them operating in competition and occasional violent conflict with each other. The Capone model, which reaches its peak in Chicago in the mid-1920s, is the most sophisticated version of this old model. Al Capone builds a genuinely impressive criminal organization, one that controls not just gambling and bootlegging, but politics, law enforcement, labor, a substantial fraction of the commercial life of the second largest city in America. He is brilliant in his way. He understands scale and organization and the specific application of violence and corruption in combination. The Capone organization at its peak is something genuinely new in American criminal history. But it has a fundamental structural problem. It is built on Al Capone, his personal authority, his personal relationships with the politicians and the police and the labor leaders and the businessmen who make the operation possible. It is not an institution, it is a court. It functions because of the specific person at its center, and it is therefore as vulnerable as that person is. When the federal government targets Al Capone personally, through the tax evasion mechanism that Elmer Eyre and the IRS develop specifically to address the visible gap between his income and his spending, the entire organization is exposed. Because the organization and the man are not separable. When the man falls, the organization falls. Meyer Lansky sees this clearly before it happens. He watches the Capone organization operating in Chicago, and he sees its brilliance, and he sees its structural failure. He sees that the model, despite its temporary success, is not the right model. Not because it is too violent, though it is too violent. Not because it attracts too much attention, though it does. But because it is fragile in the specific way that any organization built around a single person is fragile. Remove the person, and you have nothing. The model he designs instead is built around an institution, around a structure that persists regardless of which specific individuals occupy its positions, around rules and relationships and financial arrangements that exist independently of any single person's authority, around the specific understanding that the most durable form of power is not personal power, but institutional power, the kind of power that continues after the people who built it are gone. The specific moment when the new model begins to take its final form is 1929 and 1930, in the aftermath of the stock market crash, and in the shadow of the escalating violence in the Italian-American organized crime world that culminates in the Castellamarese War, the bloody conflict between competing New York families that lasts from 1929 to 1931 and leaves the landscape transformed. The violence of the war is, for Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, the demonstration of everything that is wrong with the old model. The old bosses, the men they call the Mustache Petes, are fighting over territory and respect and the specific ethnic loyalties of the Sicilian tradition. They are conducting a war that is consuming resources and attracting law enforcement attention and making everyone in the organization more vulnerable, for reasons that Meyer Lansky, analyzing the situation with the cold precision he applies to everything, cannot justify as rational. He and Lucky Luciano have been working toward the same conclusion from different directions. Luciano understands the Italian politics of the situation, the specific internal dynamics of the families, the relationships and the grievances and the specific personalities that would need to be managed in any restructuring. Meyer Lansky understands the financial logic, the organizational theory, the structural design of what should replace what exists. The two of them together constitute the complete intelligence required to build the new model. What they build is the National Crime Syndicate. The word syndicate is Meyer Lansky's choice, and the choice is deliberate. A syndicate is not a gang. It is not a family. It is not a territorial organization defined by ethnicity or geography. A syndicate is a business association, a group of individuals or organizations combining their resources and coordinating their activities for mutual benefit. The word carries the specific implication of legitimate business organization, which is exactly the implication Meyer Lansky intends. The structure is designed around several specific innovations that together constitute a genuinely new organizational model. The first innovation is the Commission, a governing body representing the major organized crime families in America, with authority to resolve territorial disputes, approve major decisions, and enforce the rules that the syndicate operates under. The Commission is not a hierarchy in the traditional sense. It is more like a board of directors. Each member has a voice. Majority decisions bind all members. The specific organizational authority is collective rather than personal. This is revolutionary. Before the Commission, territorial disputes between criminal organizations were resolved by violence. One organization attacked another. The stronger prevailed. The weaker was absorbed or destroyed. This process was expensive, unpredictable, and attracted exactly the kind of law enforcement attention that made everyone more vulnerable. The Commission replaces this process with negotiation. Disputes come to the Commission. The Commission mediates. The decision is binding. No one goes to war unilaterally. The second innovation is the ethnic integration. The National Crime Syndicate is explicitly not an Italian organization. It includes the major Italian families because those families represent the largest and most organized criminal enterprises, and their cooperation is essential. But it also includes the Jewish organized crime figures, primarily Lansky and his associates, and maintains working relationships with other ethnic organized crime communities. This integration is Meyer Lansky's specific contribution to the design, and it is one of the most significant because it is the hardest. The Italian families have deep cultural traditions of ethnic exclusivity. Convincing them to enter into formal organizational relationships with non-Italians requires sustained argument and the specific credibility that Meyer Lansky's financial intelligence provides. His argument is practical. The ethnic exclusivity of the old model is a limitation, not a strength. It prevents the organization from accessing talent and resources that exist outside the ethnic community. It creates unnecessary conflict between organizations that could be cooperating. It limits the scale of what can be achieved. A model that incorporates the best available talent regardless of ethnicity, that creates formal cooperative relationships between the major organized crime communities rather than allowing them to compete destructively, will generate more revenue and sustain less risk than the ethnic exclusivity model. The Italian bosses who accept this argument do so primarily because Meyer Lansky's financial intelligence is demonstrably valuable to them. His ability to manage the financial architecture of their operations, to move money safely and efficiently, and in ways that protect them from the specific legal mechanisms available to their adversaries, is something they cannot replicate through their own resources. His value to them is the argument for his inclusion, and by extension, the argument for the principle of talent over ethnicity that his inclusion represents. The third innovation is the financial architecture. The syndicate's operations are managed with a financial sophistication that the old ethnic gangs never possessed. Meyer Lansky designs the systems through which the syndicate's revenue is processed, protected, and invested. The offshore accounts, the front businesses, the casino operations, the layered financial structures that convert illegal revenue into invisible, legitimate wealth. This financial architecture is not just the syndicate's banking system, it is its immune system. It is the specific component of the organization that makes it resistant to the legal mechanisms that destroyed Al Capone. The fourth innovation is the separation of violence from governance. The old model used violence as a governing tool. You maintained authority by being more feared than your rivals. You resolved disputes by demonstrating the capacity for violence. This model is effective in the short term and catastrophic in the long term, because it attracts law enforcement attention and because it depends on the specific individuals who exercise the violence, making the organization as vulnerable as those individuals. The new model separates these functions. Violence, when necessary, is handled through specialized structures that are operationally distinct from the governance function. The people who make the governing decisions are not the people who execute violent resolutions of disputes. This separation creates legal distance between the organization's leadership and the specific acts that most reliably produce criminal prosecutions. It also reduces the overall level of violence, because the availability of nonviolent dispute resolution through the Commission reduces the occasions when violence is necessary. By the mid-1930s, the National Crime Syndicate is operational as a genuinely national structure. It has governing mechanisms, financial systems, territorial arrangements, and enforcement capacity. It operates in every major American city and in every major illegal industry of the era: gambling, bootlegging through the end of Prohibition and its successor operations afterward, labor racketeering, protection, numbers. The industries change over decades as the legal and social landscape changes, but the organizational structure persists. Because the structure is an institution, not a court, it does not depend on any specific person. This is the test that the syndicate passes repeatedly over the following decades. Al Capone goes to prison in a 931, and the Capone organization essentially ends. The syndicate absorbs this without disruption, because Capone was never part of the syndicate's governance structure in the way that made his removal destructive. Lucky Luciano is deported in a 946. The syndicate continues. Bugsy Siegel is killed in a 947. The syndicate continues. Boss after boss over the following decades is imprisoned or killed or deported or simply dies, and the syndicate absorbs each loss and continues functioning, because the structure is designed to be larger and more durable than any of its individual components. This durability is Meyer Lansky's greatest architectural achievement. Greater than the offshore banking system, greater than the Las Vegas investment, greater than any specific financial innovation or operational achievement. The durability of a structure that is designed from the beginning to outlast the people who build it. This is the specific quality of thinking that distinguishes the best architects from the merely competent builders. The ability to design not just for the present, but for the future, to build something that will still be standing after the builder is gone. Meyer Lansky built exactly that. The National Crime Syndicate, in its various evolved forms, operated for decades after his death and after the deaths of everyone who was in the room when it was designed. The specific structures he created have been adapted and modified, and in some cases explicitly copied by organized crime organizations around the world. The commissions that resolve territorial disputes in criminal organizations on multiple continents, the financial architectures that protect criminal revenue from law enforcement, the ethnic integration models that maximize talent regardless of origin, the separation of governance from violence that creates legal protection for organizational leadership. All of these features, which are now standard in sophisticated criminal organizations around the world, trace their design lineage to the model that Meyer Lansky built in the early 1932 from the observation that the Capone model was wrong. The Capone model was based on fear. The Lansky model was based on structure. Fear is a resource that depletes. Structure is a resource that compounds. The Capone model produced spectacular results for a short period, and then collapsed completely when its central figure was removed. The Lansky model produced durable results for decades and continues to influence organizational thinking in both criminal and legitimate contexts to this day. If this story of the man who invented modern organized crime, who replaced the Capone model with an institutional structure that changed the world, moved you, subscribe to this channel, because the architecture Meyer Lansky built is not just criminal history, it is organizational history. The specific innovations he developed, designed for criminal purposes in the early 1932, are recognizable in the structure of legitimate institutions today. The commission becomes the board of directors. The ethnic integration becomes the meritocracy. The financial architecture becomes the corporate treasury function. The separation of governance from enforcement becomes the separation of executive from operational functions. The design principles are universal. Meyer Lansky discovered them in the specific context of redesigning American organized crime. The rest of the world eventually rediscovered them in the context of building the legitimate organizations that now structure most of modern life. Drop a comment. Tell me which of his innovations you think was most consequential. And remember this, the most powerful structures are not the ones that depend on any specific person. They are the ones designed to work regardless of who is in them. Meyer Lansky understood this. He built it, and it outlasted everyone. There is a dimension of the syndicate's construction that most accounts skip over, because it is the hardest to make dramatic. It is the dimension of the actual work. Not the decisions made in back rooms, not the dramatic moments of violence that punctuate the political history, not the specific organizational changes that can be narrated as a sequence of events. the actual work of building and maintaining an institution. The daily, unglamorous, repetitive labor of making a complex organization function. Meyer Lansky did this work for 50 years. He did it with the specific quality of attention that distinguishes the people who actually build things from the people who describe building them. He reviewed financial reports. He attended management meetings. He resolved disputes that never became dramatic enough to attract historical attention. He managed the relationships between the different components of the organization with the patient precision of a man who understands that relationships are the actual substance of any institution, that the formal structures are scaffolding for the relationships rather than the reverse. This is the invisible work of institutional building. The commission and the financial architecture and the ethnic integration model are the design innovations. The intellectual contribution that justifies treating Meyer Lansky as an organizational architect of genuine historical significance. But the design is not the building. The design is the plan. The building is what you do every day for 50 years to make the plan real and keep it real against the specific pressures that work to pull it apart. The syndicate, like any complex organization, was constantly under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Internal pressure from the specific individuals whose interests conflicted with the organization's rules. External pressure from law enforcement and political adversaries. Environmental pressure from changes in the legal and social landscape that required the organization's operations to adapt. Market pressure from the changing economics of the industries the syndicate operated in. Meyer Lansky managed all of these pressures for 50 years with the organizational intelligence that he had been developing since he was a teenager. Not every decision was correct. Not every crisis was successfully navigated. The syndicate that existed in 1980 was substantially different from the syndicate of 1935, not just in its specific operations, but in its organizational culture and its relationship to the broader society it operated in. Some of those changes were improvements. Some were the natural entropy of complex organizations that persist long enough to accumulate the specific kinds of dysfunction that time produces in any institution. This persistence is the measure of the quality of the design. Most organizations, built by less capable architects, develop structural failures within a decade that require either complete rebuilding or gradual collapse. The National Crime Syndicate's design survived 50 years of operation and the deaths or removal of every single person who was involved in its construction. That is an extraordinary performance for any complex organization, and it reflects the specific quality of thinking that went into the original design. Meyer Lansky built a machine and taught it to run itself. Not perfectly. Machines never run themselves perfectly. But well enough. Consistently enough. With enough structural resilience to absorb the shocks that came, and there were many, and continue functioning. This is the specific achievement of the syndicate's architecture. Not that it was powerful, though it was. Not that it was profitable, though it was. That it was durable. That the design was correct enough to persist beyond the designer. The specific comparison that illuminates this achievement is the comparison with the organizations that existed before the syndicate and the organizations that have been built since. Every major criminal organization that preceded the syndicate was structured around a dominant individual and collapsed or was substantially transformed when that individual was removed. The Capone organization is the most famous example, but it is one of many. The syndicate was the first to solve this problem by building the institution rather than the court. By making the structure genuinely larger than any individual component, by designing for institutional persistence rather than for the personal power of the founder. The organizations built since have universally incorporated the major elements of the syndicate's design. The commission principle appears in the organizational structures of major criminal organizations around the world, from the multi-city American families that evolved from the original syndicate to the international criminal organizations that developed in Europe and Asia and Latin America in the second half of the 20th century. The financial architecture principles appear in every sophisticated criminal money management system. The separation of governance from enforcement appears wherever criminal organizations have learned the lesson that personal involvement in operational violence is a liability for leadership. These organizations did not necessarily learn these principles directly from Meyer Lansky. In many cases, they learned them from their own experience of the failure modes of simpler structures. But the principles were right. They arrived at the same design conclusions because the design problems are the same, and good design solutions to a specific set of problems converge on similar answers regardless of who is working on them. Meyer Lansky got there first, in the early 1930 seconds, because he was working on the problem earlier and more systematically than anyone else. The legitimate organizational world has made the same journey, on a different timeline and for different reasons, but toward the same design conclusions. The corporations that dominate the global economy operate on principles that are recognizable as variations of the design innovations Meyer Lansky built into the National Crime Syndicate. The board of directors that governs rather than operates. The financial systems that process and protect the organization's assets. The human resources practices that recruit and retain talent based on capability rather than origin. The legal structures that separate organizational liability from individual liability. These are the corporate world's versions of the syndicate's design innovations. This parallel is uncomfortable for anyone who prefers clean moral categories. The design innovations that Meyer Lansky developed for criminal purposes turn out to be genuinely useful organizational innovations that have been adopted by legitimate institutions because they work. The criminal and the corporate worlds arrived at similar organizational conclusions because the underlying problems of building and maintaining complex institutions are similar, regardless of whether those institutions operate within the law or outside it. Meyer Lansky never sought credit for this. He never made the case, in any public forum, that the organizational model he built was a significant contribution to human knowledge about how institutions work. He would have considered making such a case both dangerous and unnecessary. Dangerous because it would have attracted exactly the kind of attention he spent his life avoiding. Unnecessary because the work was its own validation. It worked. It lasted. That was sufficient. He built the institution, and he watched it operate for 50 years, and then he died, and the institution continued without him, which is exactly what he designed it to do. The syndicate architect. The man who looked at Al Capone and saw the model that would replace him before Capone had finished building the model that Meyer would replace. The man who understood that the future of organized power in America was institutional rather than personal, corporate rather than feudal, durable rather than spectacular, and who built that future piece by piece through the patient work of 50 years. The specific moment when the new model displaced the old one is the early 1930 seconds. And it happens not through a single dramatic event, but through a series of events that together constitute a fundamental transition. The Castellamarese War ends in 1931. Lucky Luciano, with Meyer Lansky's organizational intelligence behind him, emerges from the war in a position to restructure the Italian-American organized crime world. The bosses who represent the old model, the men who wanted to continue fighting over ethnic territory and traditional Sicilian authority structures, are gone. The men who are willing to work within a new structure remain. The specific meeting that formalizes the new arrangement has been described in various accounts with varying degrees of accuracy. What is certain is that in the early 1930 seconds, a formal agreement is reached among the major criminal organizations in America that creates the governing structure of the National Crime Syndicate. The specific terms of the agreement, the specific individuals present, the specific language used, these are not fully documented in any source that historians can verify completely. But the structure that emerged from those meetings is documented in its subsequent operation. Meyer Lansky is at the center of these meetings, as he is at the center of everything in this period. Not as the most powerful person in the room in the conventional sense. The most powerful persons in the room are the Italian family bosses, because they represent the largest and most organized criminal enterprises. But as the most indispensable person in the room. The person whose financial intelligence and organizational thinking are necessary for the structure being built to actually work. The architect, sitting in the room where the structure is being designed, the only one who fully understands how it should work and why. He argues for the specific innovations that define the new model. The commission principle, the ethnic integration, the financial architecture, the separation of governance from violence. He makes these arguments in the specific language of practical benefit rather than organizational theory. Not this is a better model in the abstract, but this specific arrangement will make all of us more money and less vulnerable to law enforcement. The argument that Meyer Lansky always makes, which is the argument that appeals to rational self-interest, because rational self-interest is the only currency that works in the room he is sitting in. The Italian bosses who accept these arguments do so because the arguments are correct, and because the person making them has the track record to make them credible. This is another dimension of the architect's specific contribution. He is not proposing untested theories. He has been building and testing organizational and financial innovations for a decade. The things he is proposing for the syndicate's design are things he has already proven in smaller contexts. His credibility as an innovator, established through demonstrated results rather than theoretical argument, is what makes the bosses willing to adopt innovations that challenge their traditional assumptions. The syndicate, once built, is immediately more effective than what preceded it. The reduction in inter-organizational violence alone produces significant benefits. The resources that had been consumed in the Castellamarese War and in the constant low-level territorial conflicts of the preceding decade are redirected toward productive operations. The law enforcement attention that had been attracted by the visible violence decreases. The financial systems that Meyer Lansky manages produce returns that demonstrate the superiority of the new approach to anyone who might be tempted to revert to the old one. By the mid-1930s, the model is established enough to be self-reinforcing. The financial benefits are too large for anyone to walk away from. The organizational habits of the commission process are sufficiently ingrained that the default response to disputes is negotiation rather than violence. The financial architecture is producing enough clean wealth that everyone in the organization has a personal interest in maintaining the system that produces it. The institutional inertia is working in the model's favor. This is the specific achievement of building something that works so well that people protect it for their own reasons, rather than out of loyalty to the builder. Meyer Lansky designed the syndicate to be self-sustaining, not just structurally, but motivationally. Everyone in the organization had personal, financial reasons to keep the system running. The system's continuation was in the rational self-interest of every participant. This alignment of institutional interest and individual interest is the most durable form of organizational design because it does not depend on external enforcement or personal loyalty. It depends on self-interest, which is the most reliable human motivation available. He understood this principle at 27 years old. He applied it to the design of the National Crime Syndicate, and the organization he designed built on the alignment of institutional and individual interest rather than on fear or loyalty, operated for decades past the death of every single person who built it. Meyer Lansky died in January 1983. He was 80 years old. The organization he designed in the early 1932s had been operating for 50 years. It had absorbed the deaths and departures and imprisonments of every founding member. It had adapted to the changing legal and social landscape of 50 years of American history. It had generated, in aggregate, wealth that dwarfs almost any comparable enterprise in that period. And it had done all of this because the design was correct. Because the architecture was built to last. Because the man who drew the plans understood, at 27, what most organizational designers never understand at any age. That the goal is not to build something that works while you are there to manage it. The goal is to build something that works after you are gone. That is the syndicate architect. That is what Meyer Lansky built. That is why the organizations that came after him in every industry and in every country look the way they look. Because the design principles he developed in the specific context of American organized crime in the early 1930s are the right design principles for complex institutions that are meant to persist. The criminal discovered them first. The world adopted them after. The design outlasted the designer, exactly as designed. One specific scene from the historical record captures the entire achievement. The initial commission meeting, reconstructed from participant accounts and investigative records assembled over decades. At this meeting, the assembled bosses are trying to work out the specifics of the territorial arrangement that will govern the new structure. The old model was territorial in the specific sense that each organization controlled a defined geography, and any incursion into that geography was an act of war. The new model needs a different approach, because the national scope of the syndicate's ambitions requires coordination that territorial exclusivity prevents. The discussion becomes heated at several points. The territorial instincts of the Italian family bosses are deeply ingrained. The idea of sharing, of coordinating, of allowing other organizations to operate in spaces that were previously exclusive territory runs against decades of cultural practice. Several of the bosses push back. The arguments for the old model are made with conviction. Meyer Lansky listens to all of it. He lets the arguments run until they have exhausted themselves, and then he makes a single observation. He says the question is not territory, it is revenue. Territory is about protecting what you have. Revenue is about growing it. And the specific financial analysis he has prepared for this meeting shows that the revenue available through coordinated national operations is substantially larger than the revenue available through the isolated territorial model. He shows the numbers. He walks through the analysis. He demonstrates, in the specific language of financial projection rather than organizational theory, what the new model is worth in dollars compared to the old model. The room goes quiet. The men who had been arguing about territory look at the financial projections. They understand what they are looking at. The commission structure is adopted not because the bosses are convinced of its organizational superiority, but because the financial analysis shows it is more profitable. This is the method, not idealism, not abstract organizational theory. Numbers. The specific financial demonstration that the new model produces more revenue and less risk than the old one. The argument that works in the room, which is the only argument that matters. The syndicate architect making his case in the only language his audience understands and trusts, which is the language of money. That meeting is the beginning of the National Crime Syndicate. A 27-year-old with a financial projection convinced a room of powerful men not through authority, but by showing the numbers. Meyer Lansky designed it. The institution was built. 50 years later, when everyone who was in that room was gone, it was still standing, exactly as designed.